Peace and welcome, everyone. I'm Aisha Musa of AIM Education and Consulting. In this video, I'll be looking at a topic I've been asked about by a lot of Muslim women: menstruation between Quran, Hadith, and Fiqh. Before turning to the primary topic of today's video, perhaps some people don't know what the word fiqh means. The Arabic word fiqh literally means understanding. As a technical term, it refers to the detailed religious legal rulings that scholars derive from the sources, which for Sunnis are the Quran, Sunnah, analogy, and consensus. The general rulings regarding menstruation, summarized here on islamqa.info, are agreed upon by all Muslim schools of religious law that use Hadith along with the Quran as a basis of religious rulings. There are, however, Muslims who question these rulings because they're not based on an explicit directive from the Quran. The Quran specifically mentions menstruation and menstruating only 4 times in 2 verses. Quran 65:4 uses both the noun al-mahid and the verb yahidna, here negated by the particle lam, and Quran 2:222 uses the noun al-mahid twice. Let's take a look at each of these 2 verses. Quran chapter 65 is titled Divorce, and verse 4 specifies the waiting period for divorce to become final for women who either no longer or do not menstruate. Quran chapter 2 verse 222 is the verse that most directly addresses menstruation. It reads, "They ask you about menstruation. Say, it is an annoyance, so withdraw from women during menstruation, and do not approach them until they are clean. Then when they've cleaned themselves, approach them from where God has commanded you. Indeed, God loves those who clean themselves." This is the only direct command given in a discussion of menstruation in the Quran. The other command given in the Quran is to divorced women to wait 3 menstrual cycles. In addition to the word al-mahid, the Quran uses the word quru in chapter 2, verse 228. This word is the plural of qar and means menstrual cycles. This is the verse that commands divorced women to wait 3 menstrual cycles before the divorce is considered final. While the Quran has little to say about menstruation, there's much more detailed information in Hadith literature. Let's take a look at some of that information now. Before turning to the Hadith themselves, I want to make a brief note on translations. In this video, I'm using the English translations of Hadith from Sunnah.com. The translations of different collections have been done by different translators, so translations of the same Arabic word may differ. For example, the translator of Sahih al-Bukhari renders the Arabic word al-hayd as menstrual periods, while the translator of Sahih Muslim translates it as menstruation. There may be other variations as well. I will only directly address those differences that lead to significant differences of interpretation. All the collections in the Sunni Hadith canon contain reports dealing with menstruation, but only the collections of al-Bukhari, Muslim, and an-Nasa'i devote a separate book or kitab to the issue. Each book is divided into chapters, abwab, and each chapter or bab contains 1 or more reports on a particular topic related to menstruation. In this video, we'll be focusing on these 3 collections. Al-Bukhari opens his book of menstrual periods, Kitab al-Hayd, with Quran chapter 2, verse 222. They ask you about menstruation. This is followed by a chapter or bab on how menses started. In the Arabic edition I consulted, al-Bukhari has used the Prophet's saying, "This is something that God has ordained for the daughters of Adam," as a subheading, then says, "Some say this was first imposed on the children of Israel." In the translation at Sunnah.com, the subheading is left untranslated, and both the subheading and the hadith that quotes the Prophet as saying menstruation is ordained are identified as Chapter 1. The full report, in which the prophet is quoted as saying that menstruation is something that God has ordained, puts the quote in the context of pilgrimage. The report emphasizes Aisha's distress at starting her period after setting out to perform pilgrimage. The prophet finds her weeping, and when he learns why, he instructs her to carry out all of the rites of pilgrimage except the circumambulation of the Kaaba. The details of the report suggest that Aisha's concern was that menstruating would interfere with completing the pilgrimage. The prophet reassures her that menstruation has been ordained by God and tells her what she should do, and that is to complete all of the rites except one. The focus is on what she should do, with the prohibition of a single rite as an exception. After the opening report in the context of pilgrimage, al-Bukhari shifts the focus from acts of worship to close personal interactions between husbands and wives, including a wife washing and combing her husband's hair, the husband reciting Quran while reclining in his wife's lap, and the husband fondling his menstruating wife. This latter is the topic with which Muslim opens his book of menstruation, as we shall see shortly. It's only after these reports detailing the permissible physical interaction between a husband and his menstruating wife that we find a report that goes back to the question of religious practices and menstruating women. In the translation of al-Bukhari on Sunnah.com, Chapter 6 is titled, quote, "A menstruating women, Fiqh, should leave observing Saum," end quote. The addition of the English word should reflects the translator's understanding that this is a religious requirement. A more literal translation is, "A menstruating woman's leaving the fast," Tarq al-Haid as-Sawm. This chapter contains a single report in which the prophet advises women to give charity to make up for their deficiency in religion. When the women ask what that deficiency is, the prophet is quoted as saying, quote, "Isn't it true that when a woman menstruates, she neither fasts nor prays?" End quote. This is my translation, which is closer to the literal Arabic than the translation at Sunnah.com. That translation reads, quote, "Isn't it true that a woman can neither fast nor pray during her menses?" End quote. The inclusion of the English word can once again reflects the translator's interpretation, and the Arabic equivalent is not in the original text. When the women reply, "Indeed," the prophet says, quote, "This is the deficiency in her religion," end quote. Notably, not praying and fasting during menses is assumed rather than commanded in this report. Inshallah, I'll vet this particular report and its variations in a future video. The direct prophetic command to discontinue prayer during menstruation appears in a report in which a woman experiencing continuous bleeding asked the prophet if she should give up praying entirely because she's never clean. The prophet informs her that this is from a blood vessel and not menses, and that she should discontinue prayer when the actual menses begins, and when it ends she should wash herself and pray. Elsewhere, other reports tell women to count the number of days and nights that they normally menstruate, or to distinguish menstrual blood from non-menstrual blood by its appearance. Muslim does not begin his book of menstruation with Quran 2:222, or the prophet's statement that menses is something that God has ordained for the daughters of Adam. Instead, he focuses immediately on conjugal relations, with a chapter on the permissibility of husbands sexually touching their menstruating wives above the waist. This chapter contains 2 reports attributed to 2 of Muhammad's wives. Muslim's opening chapter is followed by a chapter showing that it's permissible for a man to lie under the same bed cover as his menstruating wife. This chapter also contains 2 reports on the authority of Muhammad's wives. The 3rd chapter is longer and more detailed, containing 11 reports on a variety of interactions: a menstruating wife washing and combing her husband's hair, retrieving items for him from the mosque, sharing food and drink with him, and a husband reciting Quran while reclining in the lap of his wife while she's menstruating. The next several chapters, 4 through 12 of Muslim's Book of Menstruation, turn away from menstruation and deal with issues related to prostatic fluid and semen, when ablution or bathing is required, and how bathing should be done. Chapter 13 returns to the issue of menstruation with several reports advising women to use a scented cloth to cleanse themselves after menstruating. Chapter 14 takes up the issue of non-menstrual bleeding, and it's here that we find a variant of the report we saw in Bukhari, telling a woman to discontinue praying during her actual menses, but to wash and pray the rest of the time. What's noticeably absent from Muslim's Book of Menstruation is the single report we saw in al-Bukhari that assumes a menstruating woman neither fasts nor prays. In his Sunan, an-Nasa'i addresses menstruation, al-Hayd, and non-menstrual bleeding, al-Istihada, together. Like Muslim, an-Nasa'i does not head his chapter with Quran 2, verse 222, but like al-Bukhari, he opens with a report in which the Prophet is quoted as saying that menstruation is something God has decreed. The text of Nasa'i's report differs slightly from that of the report in Bukhari's Sahih, but the chain of narrators is the same except for each compiler's direct informant. After the initial report, an-Nasa'i turns immediately to the issue of non-menstrual bleeding. The next several chapters contain various reports advising women who experience non-menstrual bleeding to avoid prayer during the time of their normal menstruation and to wash and pray the rest of the time. Most of the reports are variants of those found in the Sahihs of al-Bukhari and Muslim, but an-Nasa'i also includes additional reports that advise women to calculate the days and nights that they normally menstruated or to recognize menstrual blood by its appearance. After addressing the issues related to non-menstrual bleeding, an-Nasa'i turns to permissible interactions with menstruating women. In addition to the various interactions addressed in the Sahihs of Bukhari and Muslim, an-Nasa'i also includes a report on the penalty for a man who has intercourse with his menstruating wife, which is understood to be forbidden by Quran chapter 2, verse 222. Here, too, what is noticeably absent is the report found in al-Bukhari in which not fasting or praying during menstruation is assumed. When we examine the three collections in the Sunni Hadith canon that dedicate a specific section to menstruation, we see that al-Bukhari and Muslim focus first on permissible interactions with menstruating women, while an-Nasa'i focuses first on the difference between menstrual and non-menstrual bleeding. The direct prophetic command for women to avoid praying during menstruation occurs only in the discussions of menstrual versus non-menstrual bleeding, and not praying or fasting during menstruation is assumed in a single report in the context of encouraging women to give charity. This report is included by al-Bukhari in his section dedicated to menstruation, but not those of Muslim or an-Nasa'i. Comparing the information on menstruation in the Quran and the Hadith shows that the Quran contains two commands. The first is to men, who are commanded to withdraw from their menstruating wives. This command is understood as prohibiting sexual intercourse during menstruation. The second command is for divorced women to wait 3 menstrual cycles before the divorce is considered final, allowing them to remarry. The Hadith further specify that all interactions between husbands and their menstruating wives, except intercourse, are permitted. Menstruating women should perform all rites of pilgrimage except circumambulation of the Kaaba. Not fasting or praying during menstruation is assumed in a single report, and the direct prophetic command not to pray during menstruation occurs during discussions distinguishing menstrual from non-menstrual bleeding. The fiqh rulings that prohibit prayer or fasting for menstruating women rely entirely on the Hadith literature rather than on any direct command from the Quran. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe. If you want to know more about me and my work, you'll find a link to my website in the description.